Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The spring morning of April 18, 1908, arrived with crystalline clarity in McDowell County, West Virginia. Martha Eleanor Hastings stood before the warped mirror in her family's timber frame house, fastening the final pearl button on her wedding dress. The ivory silk garment had been her grandmother's, preserved in cedar and lavender, its age making it more beautiful. Through her bedroom window, Tug Fork Mountain rose against the pale blue sky, slopes covered in new green leaves and white serviceberry blossoms. The house buzzed with preparation. Martha's mother, Clara Hastings, moved efficiently through rooms, her capable hands coordinating the chaos of 7 children. The younger sisters arranged wildflowers in mason jars, barely containing their excitement. Martha's father, Samuel Hastings, sat on the front porch in his only suit, watching the road for guests. He had worked 30 years in the coal mines, emerging each evening black as night, a man who believed in God, family, and his given word. Today, he would give his eldest daughter to Thomas Henry Morrison, a respected man who owned timberland and a sawmill 3 valleys over. The wedding would take place at noon in the small Baptist church at the crossroads where Laurel Creek met the main road to Welch. Reverend Josiah Fletcher had prepared his sermon on the sacred covenant of marriage. Church ladies had scrubbed the wooden pews until they gleamed, arranged mountain laurel and rhododendron bouquets. A wedding was not just 2 people uniting but families joining, bloodlines continuing, promising future generations to work these hills. Martha descended the narrow staircase carefully. Her sisters gasped when they saw her fully dressed, and even her mother's eyes grew misty. The dress transformed Martha from a sturdy mountain girl into something ethereal, though her strong hands spoke to her life's reality. Her mother approached with a small wooden box, worn smooth by generations. Inside lay a necklace from the Hastings family, a simple oval locket of tarnished silver on a delicate chain repaired many times. Clara lifted it reverently and fastened it around Martha's neck. The locket settled against Martha's collarbone, cool and surprisingly heavy. Her grandmother had worn it on her wedding day, and her great-grandmother before that, each bride carrying forward this link to women who had loved and endured in these unforgiving mountains. Guests began arriving in a steady stream, families from hollows and ridges wearing their Sunday best. Men had scrubbed coal dust from beneath fingernails, though some staining remained permanent. Women wore their finest dresses, carefully mended, hats trimmed with saved ribbon. Children ran wild, excited by the rare festivity. The Morrisons arrived in their wagon, Thomas handsome and nervous in a new suit. Thomas caught sight of Martha and his face transformed with pure joy. He was a good man, everyone agreed. Hardworking, honest, devoted to family and church. He had courted Martha properly for 2 years, visiting Sunday afternoons, speaking of plans to expand the sawmill, of the house he was building overlooking Horsepen Creek. He promised Martha a good life, children, security, respect. The wedding party made its way to the church in wagons and on foot, morning air filled with apple blossoms and a distant wood thrush singing. The church sat in a clearing, white paint gleaming in the sun. Inside, benches were packed with well-wishers, the small choir ready to sing old hymns. Martha walked down the narrow aisle on her father's arm, feeling every eye upon her, the locket resting against her chest like a talisman. Thomas stood at the front beside Reverend Fletcher, his face shining with happiness. The ceremony proceeded according to timeless ritual, the Reverend's voice rising and falling as he spoke of love and duty, of cleaving unto one another. The choir sang, filling the small space with ancient melodies of faith and perseverance. After vows were exchanged and Thomas kissed his new wife with appropriate modesty, the congregation erupted in celebration. The newlyweds led the procession outside, where tables had been set for the wedding feast. Women had brought their finest dishes, men had procured whiskey aged in hidden stills, and the afternoon promised music and dancing and communal joy that bound these mountain people together. It was Martha's Aunt Louisa who suggested the photograph. She had read that modern couples were commemorating weddings with professional portraits, and though there was no photographer in McDowell County, a traveling man named Edgar Whitmore had set up temporarily in Welch. The idea caught fire among guests, fueled by whiskey and celebration. Samuel Hastings was reluctant about the cost, but his wife's pleading eyes and Martha's excitement swayed him. It would be their wedding gift, he declared, and Thomas's father immediately offered to split the expense. Plans were made for the newlyweds to travel to Welch the following Monday. The celebration continued through afternoon into evening, music growing louder as whiskey flowed. Martha danced with her new husband, with her father, with uncles and cousins, her face flushed with happiness. The locket bounced gently against her chest, catching the fading light. As sun dropped behind the western ridge and first stars appeared, Martha felt profound rightness, being exactly where she was meant to be, surrounded by everyone she loved, beginning a new chapter with a good man beside her. Monday arrived with cool drizzle that turned roads to mud. Martha and Thomas rode in the Morrison wagon, protecting their wedding clothes wrapped in muslin. Welch seemed impossibly grand to Martha, who had been there only twice before. Buildings rose 2 and 3 stories high, plate glass windows displayed goods from distant cities, streets bustled with more people than she had ever seen. The railroad had brought prosperity, transforming a small mountain settlement into a booming coal town. Edgar Whitmore's temporary studio occupied the second floor near the railroad depot. The photographer was a thin, nervous man with delicate hands and careful speech. He had traveled from Charleston, he explained, seeking to document Appalachia's changing face, to capture mountain people's dignity before progress swept away traditional ways. He arranged Martha and Thomas with meticulous care, adjusting angles, positioning, fussing over the light from his requested window. The locket caught his attention immediately. The silver gleamed against the ivory of Martha's dress, drawing the eye. Whitmore asked about it, and Martha explained its history with pride. The photographer nodded approvingly, stating such personal touches made a portrait meaningful, transformed it from documentation into something capturing family essence. He positioned Martha so the locket was clearly visible, a focal point anchoring the image. The actual process of creating the photograph was lengthy and strange. Whitmore disappeared beneath a black cloth behind his camera, his muffled voice directing them to remain absolutely still, warning them that even the slightest movement could ruin the exposure. Martha held her breath, acutely aware of Thomas standing beside her, his hand warm on her shoulder, the weight of the locket against her chest. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment, the camera's single eye capturing something essential about who they were, fixing them forever in this instant of hope and promise. Whitmore emerged from beneath his cloth with a satisfied expression, assuring them that the image would be magnificent, that their grandchildren would treasure it. The plates would need to be developed, he explained, and prints made, but he would have everything ready by the end of the week. They could collect the portrait on Saturday, or if they preferred, he could arrange for it to be delivered, though that would incur an additional charge. Thomas stated they would return to collect it themselves, not wanting to risk damage to something so precious in the uncertain hands of a delivery service. The week passed in a blur of adjustment for Martha as she settled into her new life as Mrs. Thomas Morrison. The house overlooking Horsepen Creek was not yet finished, so they stayed with Thomas's parents in the large timber house that had sheltered 3 generations of Morrisons. Martha learned the rhythms of her new family, the preferences of her mother-in-law, the expectations that came with her changed status. She was no longer a daughter but a wife, and though the role felt strange at first, she worked hard to fulfill it with grace and competence. Saturday arrived clear and warm, the kind of late spring day that made the mountains seem like paradise. Martha and Thomas made the journey back to Welch, both excited to see the finished photograph. Whitmore greeted them warmly, clearly pleased with his work. He had mounted the portrait in an elegant frame of dark wood, the image protected behind glass. When he turned it to face them, both Martha and Thomas gasped at the power of what they saw. The photograph was indeed magnificent. The clarity and detail surpassed anything either of them had imagined. They could see every fold in Martha's dress, every button and bit of lace. Thomas's face showed his earnest devotion, his pride in his new wife evident even in the frozen stillness of the image. And there, at the center of the composition, the locket gleamed with startling clarity, every detail of its surface visible, every scratch and repair mark preserved in silver nitrate and light. It was only later, after they had returned home and hung the portrait in the front room of the Morrison house, that anyone noticed something unusual about the locket. Thomas's youngest sister, a sharp-eyed girl of 12 named Ruth, was studying the photograph with the intense focus of the young when she suddenly called out for everyone to come and see. There, visible in the incredible detail of Whitmore's lens, was something none of them had noticed when looking at the locket with the naked eye. The surface of the pendant bore an inscription, so faint and worn that it had gone undetected for generations, but the camera's unforgiving precision had captured it with perfect clarity. The discovery of the inscription transformed the wedding portrait from a cherished keepsake into something troubling and strange. The Morrison family gathered around the photograph in the evening light, squinting at the tiny letters visible in the locket's silver surface, trying to understand what they meant. Thomas's father, William Morrison, was the first to speak the question that hung in the air like smoke from a coal fire. Who was James Brennan, and why did he bear a year that preceded Martha's great-grandmother's birth by at least a decade? More troubling still, why did a Hastings family heirloom carry the name of a Brennan, a surname entirely unfamiliar to anyone present? Martha felt a cold dread settling in her stomach as she stared at the name captured forever in the photograph. The locket had seemed such a simple, precious thing when her mother fastened it around her neck on her wedding morning. Now it felt heavy with implications she could not begin to understand. Thomas placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his face troubled but determined. They would get to the bottom of this mystery, he assured her, certain there was a reasonable explanation that would resolve any concerns. The following morning, a Sunday, Martha and Thomas made the walk back to the Hastings house before church, the framed portrait wrapped carefully in cloth and carried with the reverence one might afford a religious relic. The morning was thick with fog that clung to the hollows and obscured the ridge tops, the world reduced to gray shadows and the drip of moisture from new leaves. Martha's heart hammered in her chest as they approached her family home, dreading the conversation ahead but knowing it could not be avoided. Samuel and Clara Hastings received them in the front room, their faces lighting with pleasure at the unexpected visit until they saw the serious expressions their daughter and new son-in-law wore. Thomas unwrapped the portrait and propped it against the wall, and for a moment, Martha's parents simply admired the image, remarking on how fine Martha looked, how dignified Thomas appeared, how skillfully the photographer had captured the moment. Then Thomas directed their attention to the locket, specifically to the inscription that had been invisible to the eye but was now preserved for all to see. Clara Hastings leaned close, her breath fogging the glass slightly as she studied the tiny letters. Her face went pale, and she reached out to steady herself against the table, her other hand moving unconsciously to her throat. Samuel demanded to know what had upset his wife, and Clara pointed with a trembling finger at the inscription, unable or unwilling to speak the name aloud. Samuel squinted at the writing, his lips moving silently as he made out the letters. When understanding came, his face hardened into an expression Martha had seen only a handful of times in her life, usually before he delivered punishment to one of his children for some serious transgression. The room fell into a heavy silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant call of a crow. Finally, Clara sank into a chair and began to speak, her voice low and strained. The story she told was one Martha had never heard, a piece of family history that had been deliberately buried, hidden away like the locket itself had been hidden in that small wooden box, emerging only for weddings and then being carefully stored away again, its secrets unexamined. James Brennan had been a real person, Clara explained, not some distant ancestor but someone much closer to their present moment. He had been a young man from a Catholic Irish family that had settled in these mountains 2 generations earlier, working the same mines, farming the same difficult soil as everyone else. He had been handsome and charming, blessed with the gift of words and a singing voice that could make the hardest heart soften. Martha's grandmother, Sarah Jane Crawford before she married, had fallen desperately in love with him when she was just 17 years old. The love between Sarah Jane and James had been passionate and all-consuming, the kind of romance that songs and stories celebrated. But it had also been impossible. The Crawford family were strict Baptists who viewed Catholics with deep suspicion, and Sarah Jane's father had made it clear that he would never permit his daughter to marry outside their faith. Moreover, the Brennans were poor even by mountain standards, and James had a reputation, deserved or not, for drinking and quick temper. When Sarah Jane's father discovered the relationship, he had forbidden her to see James ever again, threatening to disown her if she disobeyed. Sarah Jane had been heartbroken but obedient, or so everyone believed. She had accepted the courtship of Marcus Hastings, Martha's grandfather, a solid and respectable man from a good Baptist family. The wedding had been arranged quickly, some whispered too quickly, but such speculation had died away when Sarah Jane gave birth to Clara 9 months after the ceremony, the timing perfectly appropriate and silencing any talk. Sarah Jane had become a dutiful wife and mother, raising her children in the faith, supporting her husband through the hardships of mountain life, and by all appearances, she had put her youthful infatuation with James Brennan completely behind her. But Clara now revealed something she had discovered only after her mother's death 15 years earlier. While sorting through Sarah Jane's belongings, Clara had found letters hidden in the lining of an old trunk, letters exchanged between her mother and James Brennan during the brief, intense period of their romance. The letters were passionate and desperate, full of promises and plans for a future together that would never materialize. In one letter, James had written that he was having a locket made for Sarah Jane, a token of his eternal devotion, with his name and the year of their love inscribed inside where only she would ever see it. He had given her the locket shortly before her father discovered their relationship and ended it. Sarah Jane had kept the locket hidden throughout her marriage to Marcus Hastings. Clara continued, never wearing it, never showing it to anyone, but never destroying it either. After Marcus died in a mine accident when Clara was just a girl, Sarah Jane had begun wearing the locket occasionally, always tucked beneath her clothing where no one could see. She had told Clara only that it was a family heirloom, something precious that should be passed down to future daughters. Clara had accepted this explanation without question, never examining the locket closely, never thinking to look for any inscription on its worn surface. As for James Brennan, Clara could provide only fragments of information. He had left McDowell County shortly after Sarah Jane's marriage, heading west like so many young men seeking fortune or escape or both. Rumors reached the mountains occasionally over the years. Someone had seen him working in the coal fields of Pennsylvania. Another claimed he had died in a mining accident in Colorado. A third report placed him running a saloon in California. But no one knew for certain what had become of him, and after a while, people stopped talking about him altogether. He became a ghost, a might have been, a road not taken. The revelation left Martha feeling unmoored and strange, as though the foundations of her understanding of her family had shifted beneath her feet. Her grandmother, whom she had known as a quiet, pious woman devoted to her children and grandchildren, had carried this secret love her entire adult life, hidden in a silver locket against her heart. Martha thought of all the times she had seen her grandmother at church, singing hymns with her eyes closed, and wondered what she had really been thinking about, what private joys or sorrows she had been revisiting in the privacy of her own mind. Thomas, ever practical, asked the question that would shape everything that followed. Did this mean that Sarah Jane had maintained contact with James Brennan throughout her marriage? Could she have met with him secretly? Could there be letters or other evidence of an ongoing relationship? And most troubling of all, given that Clara was born 9 months after Sarah Jane's wedding to Marcus Hastings, was there any possibility that the timing could have been managed to hide an earlier conception? The implications of that question hung in the air like poison. If Sarah Jane had been pregnant with James Brennan's child when she married Marcus Hastings, then Clara was not Marcus's daughter but James's. And if Clara was James Brennan's daughter, then Martha herself carried Brennan blood, making her not fully a Hastings, not the person everyone believed her to be, and certainly not the woman Thomas Morrison had thought he was marrying. Samuel Hastings erupted in fury at the suggestion, his face flushing red as he shouted that it was vile speculation, an insult to the memory of his mother, and he would not tolerate such talk in his house. Clara wept quietly, torn between defending her mother's virtue and confronting the unsettling questions that the locket's inscription had raised. Martha felt paralyzed, unable to speak or move, watching her family fracture around the revelation of a name and a date preserved in silver. The argument might have escalated further if not for the arrival of Martha's Aunt Louisa, Samuel's older sister, who had heard raised voices and come to investigate. When the situation was explained to her, she stood silently for a long moment, studying the photograph, before asking to speak with Samuel and Clara privately. Thomas and Martha were sent outside to wait on the porch, sitting on the worn steps where Martha had spent countless hours of her childhood, the familiar landscape now feeling strange and uncertain. Inside, Louisa told her younger brother something she had kept secret for 4 decades. She had been present the night before Sarah Jane married Marcus Hastings, helping the bride prepare as older sisters and cousins did. Sarah Jane had been distraught, weeping uncontrollably, clutching the silver locket and saying James's name over and over. Louisa had tried to comfort her, assuring her that these feelings would pass, that she would grow to love Marcus, that a good marriage was built on respect and partnership rather than passion. But Sarah Jane had confessed something to Louisa that night, something Louisa had sworn never to reveal but which now seemed necessary to bring into the light. Sarah Jane had told Louisa that she and James Brennan had been intimate just once, 3 weeks before her father discovered their relationship. She believed she might be pregnant with his child. Her father, sensing something was wrong and perhaps having his own suspicions, had arranged her engagement to Marcus Hastings with almost violent speed. The wedding had been rushed through, and everyone assumed it was because Marcus was eager or because the harvest was coming and timing mattered for these things. But Sarah Jane knew the truth, and she had shared it with Louisa in the desperate hope that someone else would know, would remember, would bear witness to the truth of who she was and who she loved. When Clara was born 9 months after the wedding, Sarah Jane had examined the infant with frightened eyes, looking for any resemblance to James. But babies are inscrutable, Louisa explained, their features undefined, capable of looking like anyone or no one. As Clara grew, Sarah Jane must have looked for signs, trying to determine whether the child was Marcus's or James's. But Clara had been a perfect blend of both families, her features neutral enough to belong to either lineage, offering no definitive answer to the question that must have haunted Sarah Jane every day of her motherhood. Samuel was shattered by this revelation. He had worshipped his mother's memory, built his sense of identity around being Marcus Hastings' son, raised his own children with the values and pride of the Hastings name. To learn that his mother might have deceived her husband, might have married one man while carrying another man's child, violated everything he believed about honesty and righteousness. Clara's reaction was more complex. She felt a strange mixture of grief for her mother's suffering, anger at the deception, and an unsettling curiosity about whether James Brennan might have been her true father. The immediate question was what to do with this information. Samuel's first instinct was to bury it again, to take the photograph down, to never speak of the locket or its inscription again, to forbid anyone from pursuing the matter further. But Thomas, showing the careful reasoning that made him a good businessman, pointed out that the truth had a way of emerging whether one wanted it to or not. The photograph existed, the inscription was visible to anyone who looked closely, and people in these mountains had long memories and loved nothing better than solving puzzles about lineage and blood. Better to investigate thoroughly now, in private, than to have speculation and rumors spread through the community later. After hours of painful discussion, a decision was made. They would try to find out what had become of James Brennan, whether he was still alive, whether there were any records or evidence that might illuminate the truth about Clara's paternity. Louisa remembered that the Brennan family had moved to Pocahontas County, Virginia, not long after James left, driven out by the scandal and the hostility of neighbors who viewed them as troublemakers. Perhaps some of them were still there, perhaps they knew something about what had happened to James. Thomas volunteered to make inquiries, saying he could justify a trip to Virginia on business related to timber contracts. Samuel reluctantly agreed, though he insisted that the investigation be conducted with absolute discretion. No one outside the immediate family could know what they were pursuing. Martha's wedding portrait was taken down from its place of honor in the Morrison house and stored away, too painful and complicated to display. The joyous beginning of Martha's married life had been overshadowed by ghosts and questions, by a name inscribed in silver that reached across 4 decades to trouble the present with the unresolved passions of the past. Thomas Morrison departed for Virginia on a cool morning in early June, carrying with him a carefully prepared story about seeking new timber contracts in the mountain regions along the state border. His absence left Martha in a strange limbo, Caught between her new life with the Morrison family and the turmoil that had erupted in her own family over the inscription on the locket, she moved through her days in a daze, performing her duties mechanically while her mind circled endlessly around the questions that had no easy answers. The Morrison family had been kind about the situation, at least outwardly. Thomas's mother had made sympathetic noises about how difficult it must be for Martha, discovering such troubling family history just as she was beginning her marriage. But Martha could sense the subtle shift in how she was regarded, a new wariness in the eyes of her mother-in-law, as though Martha might carry some taint from her grandmother's possible transgression. The comfortable ease she had begun to feel in her new home evaporated, replaced by a self-consciousness that made every interaction feel strained and performative. Martha found herself thinking constantly about her grandmother Sarah Jane, trying to reconcile the woman she had known with the passionate young girl who had loved James Brennan. She remembered her grandmother's hands, gnarled with arthritis but always busy, always working. She remembered the hymns her grandmother had loved, particularly the ones about longing for heaven, for a better place beyond this vale of tears. Had those songs carried additional meaning for her, Martha wondered? Had she been singing not just about spiritual salvation but about a love denied, a life unlived, a choice taken from her by the rigid expectations of family and faith? Clara Hastings visited Martha several times during Thomas's absence, the two women seeking comfort in each other's company as they waited for news. Clara seemed to have aged years in the span of weeks, her face drawn with worry and a profound uncertainty about her own identity. She confessed to Martha that she found herself studying her reflection in the mirror, looking for traces of the Brennan family she had never known, wondering whether her features bore any resemblance to the man who might be her father. She had pulled out all the old family photographs she possessed, comparing her childhood face to images of Marcus Hastings, finding both similarities and differences, able to convince herself either way depending on her mood and the light. The question of bloodline and legitimacy carried weight beyond mere emotional turmoil. If Clara was James Brennan's daughter rather than Marcus Hastings's, it meant that Martha's entire lineage on her mother's side was different than what had been recorded and believed. It meant that she carried the blood of Irish Catholics rather than proud Scots-Irish Baptists. In the social geography of these mountains, where family names carried histories of feuds and alliances, where religious divisions ran deep and marriage outside one's faith was viewed with grave suspicion, such a revelation could have consequences that rippled through generations. More practically, there were property considerations. Marcus Hastings had left a small piece of land to his children when he died, land that Samuel and his siblings had inherited as his rightful heirs. If it could be proven that Clara was not Marcus's biological child, her claim to that inheritance might be challenged. Samuel's siblings, including Aunt Louisa, had so far been sworn to secrecy about the discovery, but family loyalty had its limits when property and money were at stake. The longer the uncertainty persisted, the greater the risk that the secret would leak out, that someone would see advantage in exposing the truth or advantage in suppressing it. Thomas returned after 2 weeks that felt like 2 months, his face haggard from travel and his expression grave. He had found the Brennan family in Pocahontas County, or what remained of them. James's parents had both died years earlier, but he had located 2 of James's younger sisters, now elderly women with children and grandchildren of their own. They had been willing to talk, though they had regarded Thomas with suspicion at first, wondering what a stranger from West Virginia wanted with ancient family history. The story Thomas pieced together from his conversations with James's sisters, supplemented by visits to county courthouses and inquiries with old-timers who remembered the family, was both more and less dramatic than anyone had anticipated. James Brennan had indeed left McDowell County in 1863, shortly after Sarah Jane Crawford married Marcus Hastings. He had been devastated by the loss of the woman he loved, heartbroken and angry at a world that seemed determined to deny him happiness based on his family's faith and poverty. James had gone west, working in coal mines from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Illinois, moving every few months when restlessness or trouble drove him onward. He had developed a serious drinking problem, his sisters admitted with sorrow, something that had plagued him all his adult life. In 1867, he had been involved in a mining accident that left him badly injured, his back permanently damaged, his ability to do hard physical labor compromised. He had drifted after that, working odd jobs, living rough, increasingly isolated from his family who received only occasional letters telling them he was alive but offering few details about his circumstances. The last confirmed sighting of James Brennan was in 1874, when he appeared at his parents' home in Virginia looking thin and ill, his body ravaged by years of hard drinking and harder living. He had stayed for 3 weeks, long enough for his mother to nurse some strength back into him, and during that time, he had talked endlessly about Sarah Jane Crawford, the girl he had loved and lost. He still carried her memory like a wound that would not heal, his sisters reported. He believed that she had been his one chance at real happiness, that losing her had set him on a path of destruction from which he could never recover. James had left Virginia after those 3 weeks, saying he was heading to Kentucky where he had heard there was work. His sisters never saw him again. They received no more letters, heard no more news. They made inquiries through various channels over the years, but James Brennan seemed to have simply vanished. Whether he had died in some accident, whether he had deliberately cut all ties with his past, whether he had succeeded in drinking himself to death in some anonymous boarding house or mining camp, no one could say. He had become a ghost, erased from the official record, existing only in the memories of his aging sisters and in the silver locket he had given to his beloved. What Thomas had definitively established was that James Brennan had never married, had never fathered any legitimate children that his family knew about. His sisters were certain of this, stating that James had told them during his last visit that he could never marry anyone else, that Sarah Jane had been his one true love and he would not dishonor her memory by settling for less. If Clara was indeed James's daughter, she was his only child, the only continuation of his bloodline, born to the woman he loved but raised by another man, forever beyond his reach. Thomas also brought back something else, a discovery that he produced with obvious reluctance. While examining old county records in Virginia, he had found a document that shed new light on the timing of events. James Brennan had been arrested in March of 1863 for public drunkenness and had spent 3 days in the county jail. The arrest had occurred in Pocahontas County, where he had gone to visit his family, and the date was 2 days after Sarah Jane Crawford married Marcus Hastings in McDowell County. This timeline suggested that James had not simply drifted away heartbroken but had returned to West Virginia before the wedding, possibly trying one last time to stop it or to convince Sarah Jane to run away with him. His arrest for drunkenness immediately after suggested the depth of his despair when he failed. But it also raised the question of whether he and Sarah Jane had seen each other during that final visit, whether the intimacy Louisa had mentioned might have occurred not 3 weeks before the wedding as Sarah Jane had claimed, but in the final desperate days before she was bound to another man. If that were the case, if Sarah Jane had been with James just days before her wedding, then the timing of Clara's birth 9 months later became even more ambiguous. It would have been virtually impossible to determine whether Marcus or James was the father, the potential conception dates overlapping almost completely. Sarah Jane herself might not have known whose child she carried, an uncertainty that must have added another layer of torment to her already complicated life. The family gathered again to hear Thomas's report, this time in the Hastings home with Aunt Louisa present. The atmosphere was somber, almost funereal, as Thomas laid out what he had learned. When he finished, a long silence fell over the room. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. It seemed they would never know the truth with certainty. Clara could be Marcus Hastings's daughter or James Brennan's daughter, and without living witnesses or more definitive evidence, the question would remain forever unanswered. But Clara surprised everyone by speaking up with unexpected force. She said she had been thinking a great deal during the weeks of Thomas's absence, and she had come to a conclusion. Whether or not James Brennan was her biological father, Marcus Hastings had raised her, had loved her, had worked himself into an early grave providing for her and her siblings. He had been her father in every way that mattered. Her mother, whatever mistakes she might have made as a young woman, had been a devoted wife and mother, had honored her marriage vows for 40 years, had raised her children in faith and love. The locket and its inscription did not change these fundamental truths. Moreover, Clara continued, the uncertainty itself might be a kind of answer. Her mother had kept the locket hidden for a reason. She had never told her husband about James, never tried to contact him, never acknowledged him publicly. Whatever passionate love she had felt as a 17-year-old girl, she had chosen to set it aside and build a life with the man she married. That choice, sustained over decades, was worth respecting. To pursue the question of Clara's paternity further would be to disrespect that choice, to suggest that biological connection mattered more than lived experience, than years of daily devotion and care. Martha felt something release in her chest as her mother spoke. The obsessive circling of her thoughts began to slow. Her mother was right. The truth, if there was a single truth to be found, was less important than how they chose to respond to uncertainty. She could choose to define herself by this mysterious shadow that had fallen across her family history, or she could choose to honor the people who had raised her, who had loved her, who had shaped who she was through their example and care. But there remained the practical question of the wedding portrait and the locket. The photograph existed, the inscription was visible, and sooner or later, someone would notice and ask questions. Thomas, displaying the problem-solving skills that made him successful in business, proposed a solution. They would have a new portrait made, he suggested. Edgar Whitmore was still in Welch, still taking photographs. They could return to his studio and have another wedding portrait created, this time without the locket. They could say the first photograph had been damaged, or they could simply retire it to private storage and display only the new one. In time, people's memories would fade, and the second portrait would become the definitive record of their wedding day. The suggestion was met with relief and agreement. It felt like a way forward, a method of acknowledging the past while choosing not to be defined by it. They would create a new image, one that represented not historical truth in all its complexity but the simpler truth of who they were choosing to be. The locket would be put away, perhaps someday shown to Martha's own children with an explanation about family history and the complicated nature of love and loyalty, but for now, it would rest in its wooden box, its secret inscription hidden once more. The return to Edgar Whitmore's studio in Welch occurred on a bright Saturday morning in late June, when the mountains were lush with summer growth and the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle. Martha and Thomas dressed again in their wedding clothes, the garments now carrying associations more complicated than they had 6 weeks earlier. Martha's mother had carefully removed the locket from the wooden box and fastened instead a simple strand of pearls around her daughter's neck, borrowed from Thomas's mother, carrying no history beyond their smooth, uniform beauty. The photographer greeted them with surprise and concern, assuming something had gone wrong with the first portrait. Thomas explained smoothly that while they treasured the original photograph, they wanted another version, perhaps with slightly different positioning, maybe something that captured a more relaxed mood now that the nervousness of the wedding day had passed. Whitmore accepted this explanation with the easy agreeability of a businessman who had learned not to question customers' requests, particularly when they were willing to pay for additional services. The second session proceeded much like the first, though Martha found herself more aware of the artifice involved, the way Whitmore manipulated angles and light to create an illusion of naturalness, the way he directed their expressions and postures to achieve the image he envisioned. The pearls at her throat felt light compared to the locket, lacking the weight of history, and she was surprised to realize she missed that weight, missed the sense of connection to the women who had come before her, even knowing now how complicated that connection was. During a pause while Whitmore changed photographic plates, Martha asked him about his work, what he hoped to accomplish with his documentation of mountain people. The photographer's thin face became animated as he explained his vision. He believed that Appalachia was on the brink of profound transformation, he said. The coal industry was expanding rapidly, bringing railroads and modern commerce, drawing mountain people away from their traditional ways of life and into the industrial economy. Within a generation or two, he predicted, the culture that had evolved in these isolated hills over centuries would be largely gone, replaced by something more standardized, more connected to the broader American experience but also less distinctive, less rooted in particular places and histories. His photographs, Whitmore explained, were meant to preserve a record of this vanishing world. Not as exotic curiosities or primitive subjects to be condescended to, but as dignified people worthy of respect and remembrance. He wanted future generations to be able to look back and see their ancestors not as backwards hillbillies but as men and women who had carved lives of meaning and beauty out of harsh circumstances, who had maintained values of family and faith and community against enormous difficulties. Martha found herself moved by Whitmore's explanation, seeing her own community through his eyes, understanding the precariousness of the world she had always assumed would simply continue forever. She thought about her father's generation, men who had worked the mines and farms their entire lives, and her own generation, increasingly drawn to towns and cities where wages were higher and life was easier. She thought about the locket hidden away in its wooden box, a relic of passions and choices that had shaped lives but would soon pass beyond living memory, known only through stories that would grow more vague and uncertain with each retelling. When the new portrait was finished and framed, it showed Martha and Thomas in almost the same poses as the first photograph but with subtle differences. There was a slightly greater distance between them, a fractional turn of Martha's head that made her seem to be looking past the camera towards something beyond the frame. The pearls at her throat were clearly visible but unremarkable, pretty but impersonal, telling no stories. It was a beautiful portrait, everyone agreed, dignified and handsome, suitable for display in any home. The original photograph, with its too clear revelation of the locket's inscription, was stored in a trunk in the Morrison attic, wrapped in cloth and put away with other family items that were kept but not displayed. Martha sometimes thought about it up there in the darkness, the image frozen in silver, the letters of James Brennan's name captured with cruel precision by Whitmore's expensive lens, preserved long after the man himself had vanished into unmarked history. Life resumed its rhythms. Thomas's sawmill prospered as the demand for lumber grew with the coal boom. Martha became pregnant that fall, and the news brought joy to both families, a sense that life was moving forward despite the troubling questions raised by the locket. When her daughter was born the following spring, Martha named her Sarah after her grandmother, a name that now carried layers of meaning it had not possessed before. Little Sarah would grow up knowing only the simplified story of her great-grandmother, the approved version that edited out the complications and preserved the image of a dutiful woman who had lived according to the values of her faith and community. But Martha kept the locket, despite suggestions from both her mother and mother-in-law that it might be better to sell it or get rid of it entirely. She stored it in her own wooden box, occasionally taking it out when she was alone to hold it in her palm and trace the barely visible inscription with her finger. James Brennan, 1863. A name and a date, a man and a moment, preserved by accident or intention in the silver surface of a token of love. Over the years, as she raised her children and built her life with Thomas, Martha sometimes wondered about the choices her grandmother had made. Had Sarah Jane regretted marrying Marcus Hastings instead of fighting harder for James Brennan? Or had she been grateful, in the end, for the stability and respect her marriage had provided, even if it lacked the passionate intensity of her first love? Had she spent 40 years wishing for a different life, or had she found peace and even happiness in the life she had been given? Martha came to believe that the truth was probably more complicated than either extreme. Her grandmother had likely experienced both regret and gratitude, both loss and fulfillment, sometimes simultaneously, the human heart being large enough to contain contradictions that logic could not reconcile. She had carried James Brennan's memory in a silver locket against her heart, but she had also risen each morning to cook breakfast for Marcus, had sewn his shirts and washed his clothes, had borne and raised his children, had prayed at his side in church and mourned genuinely at his grave. Both truths existed together, neither canceling out the other. The question of Clara's paternity was never resolved and eventually stopped being actively discussed. Clara herself seemed to find a kind of peace with the uncertainty, occasionally remarking that she had been fortunate to have been claimed and loved by Marcus Hastings, whether or not his blood ran in her veins. Samuel struggled more with the ambiguity, his sense of family identity deeply shaken, but over time, he seemed to accept that some questions did not have clear answers, that the past was often more complicated than the neat stories families told themselves. The wider community never learned about the inscription on the locket or the questions it had raised. When people asked about the wedding portrait displayed in the Morrison home, they saw only a handsome young couple beginning their life together, the image reassuringly conventional in its depiction of mountain respectability. The other portrait remained hidden in the attic, a secret history visible only to the family members who chose to look. Martha lived a long life, long enough to see her children grown and married, long enough to hold grandchildren in her arms and teach them the old songs her own grandmother had taught her. She remained married to Thomas for 53 years, a partnership that weathered the usual trials of mountain life, economic hardships, illnesses, the loss of children, the changes that came with coal's decline and the region's increasing poverty. Their marriage was solid and affectionate, built on mutual respect and shared history, if not the kind of consuming passion that songs celebrated and that might drive a young girl to defy her family and faith. In her old age, Martha sometimes took out the locket and studied it, the inscription now barely visible even to her failing eyes, worn away by time as surely as James Brennan himself had been worn away and forgotten. She wondered whether her grandmother would be pleased or disturbed to know that the secret she had kept so carefully had been revealed by a machine, by the impersonal precision of a camera lens that captured more than human eyes could see. Technology had exposed what discretion had hidden, and the revelation had troubled the waters of family history in ways that were still rippling outward through the generations. But Martha also came to appreciate the gift that the revelation had given her, even though she would never have chosen to receive it. The discovery of the locket's inscription had forced her to think more deeply about family, about love, about the difference between biological connection and chosen devotion. It had taught her that history was not a simple story with clear heroes and villains but a complex tangle of choices and circumstances that shaped lives in ways both obvious and subtle. It had made her more compassionate, more willing to withhold judgment, more aware of the hidden struggles that people carried through their days. When Martha died in 1972 at the age of 86, the locket passed to her oldest daughter Sarah, who had been told the story of James Brennan and the inscription and the 2 wedding portraits. Sarah kept the locket but never wore it, respecting the complicated legacy it represented. She had her own children examine it under magnification, confirming that the inscription was indeed there, now so worn as to be almost invisible, readable only because they knew what to look for. The original wedding portrait, the one that had started everything, was eventually donated to a county historical society by one of Martha's great-grandchildren who was sorting through family belongings. A young archivist cataloging the collection noticed the inscription on the locket visible in the photograph and spent several weeks trying to identify who James Brennan might have been and why his name appeared on a Hastings family heirloom in a Morrison family portrait. She never solved the mystery, though she produced a lovely exhibit about early 20th century Appalachian wedding customs that used Martha's portrait as a centerpiece. The exhibit text noted the visible inscription on the locket, speculating that it might represent an earlier marriage, a deceased relative being honored, or perhaps a family friend who had given a gift to mark the occasion. The archivist had no way of knowing the true story, no way of accessing the hidden history of love and loss and choice that the locket represented. She saw only what the photograph showed, a young couple on their wedding day, earnest and hopeful, beginning a journey together, the woman wearing a lovely antique locket that caught the light and drew the eye to the center of the image. In the end, that was perhaps the truest thing the photograph could show. Not the secret inscription or the passionate love or the anguished choices, but the simple fact of 2 people standing together at the beginning of their shared life, carrying the past with them into an uncertain future, shaped by forces both visible and hidden, choosing every day to honor the commitments they had made, building something real and lasting out of the complicated materials of human love and loyalty. The camera had captured more than Edgar Whitmore intended, revealing a name that should have remained hidden, but it had also captured something essential about the nature of marriage and family, the way the past is always present, always influencing, always demanding to be acknowledged even when it cannot be fully understood. The mountains where all of this took place remain, though the communities that filled their hollows have largely emptied out, the coal mines closed, the young people gone to cities in search of work and opportunity. The churches still stand, many of them abandoned or converted to other uses, their congregations dissolved. The names persist in cemeteries, carved in weathered stone, marking the passage of people who loved and worked and made choices that seemed momentous at the time but have been largely forgotten by everyone except the occasional genealogist or historian trying to piece together fragments of vanished lives. Somewhere in a historical society archive, Martha's wedding portrait rests in climate-controlled storage, occasionally pulled out for exhibits about Appalachian life or early photography or the social history of rural America. Visitors glance at it, perhaps pause to read the caption about the inscription on the locket, and move on to the next image, never knowing the full story of what that photograph contains, what it revealed, what it meant to the people it captured in a moment that felt eternal but lasted only as long as it took silver nitrate to be exposed to light. And in the hollow places of memory, in the spaces between what is known and what is forgotten, James Brennan exists as a name and a date, a ghost of passion and might have been, loved intensely by a woman who married someone else, father perhaps to a daughter he never knew, dying alone and unmourned in some anonymous place far from the mountains that had been his home. His memory, like the inscription bearing his name, faded with time until it was barely visible, readable only by those who knew to look for it, who understood that love, even when denied or buried or hidden away, leaves traces that persist long after everyone involved has turned to dust. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.